Hi, everyone. This is Christiane Smith from Unanet. Thank you for joining us today for our customer webinar regarding cost reimbursement contracts and how to handle them in Unanet. Very excited to be joined today by Jason Husband, who's a senior business consultant in our professional services group. Jason, are you there?
Yep, I'm here, Christiane.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. And also Patty Cantor's here from our customer success management team. Hi, Patty.
Hi everyone.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this topic, and I think it's going to be a great session. Before we get started on the content of the session, I did just want to go through a couple of quick items with you. I know that there were many folks that could hear me, and hopefully you're able to see my screen and everything's moving around here. Let me go to the next slide. If you have any issues during the webinar itself, if you see a message, for example, that your internet audio is not available, you can always redial in to the conference line. Additionally, if you are just having things kind of being stuck or slow, you may want to drop off and just reconnect. That seems to work pretty frequently to get folks back in. If you miss out on some of the webinar today, we will be recording the webinar, and it will be available in our Knowledge Center, kc.unanet.com. You'll receive a follow-up email based on your registration, which will include a link to the webinar page. And we'll have this webinar available in about a week for you to watch out on the Knowledge Center. So I believe that's about all of the logistical items I have here for today. So we're going to get into our agenda, and I'm going to pass things over to Jason so that he can start our presentation. So give us just a minute while I make that quick switch.
All right.
Here we go. Okay, great. Thanks, Jason.
Hey, thank you, Christiane. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. And just one other quick note before you get started, Jason. As we go through the webinar today, we'd be happy to have you type in your questions to the question box in the GoToWebinar. If your GoToWebinar is taking up some space on your screen, there is an arrow, red arrow that you can push the GoToWebinar and collapse it over to the side. Also, there is a questions area. Please type in your questions, and at the end of the webinar, we'll go through and review your questions. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Christiane. So yeah, today we'll start out just to give you an overview of the topics we'll be covering today. It's how to handle the four commonly seen types of cost-plus contracts. So with that said, we'll start off first just discussing some administrative setup items that we would need to consider in regards to configuring the system to handle cost plus. We'll discuss some cost plus basics in the four common types that we most often see and how to handle those within Unanet. And we'll finish up with some other, it's a handbag of other considerations as it pertains to cost plus. All right, so in terms of administrative setup, the two key items we need to make sure we have configured appropriately would be the cost structures and our posting options. So our cost structures are what allows us to apply indirect rates to projects for profitability reporting and for billing cost plus, whereas posting options determine the rate that's used for billing and revenue recognition on cost plus projects. So that said, I'm going to jump into my demo environment here real quick. So here on this screen, we're showing cost structure. So this is within our admin setup. And within each cost structure is where we define our expense type mappings to the various cost elements. We define how indirect rates are going to be applied to those cost elements. And we can also manage our indirect rates within the cost structure setup as well. All right, and next would be the posting options. That's within admin setup as well. The two key elements here are going to be our cost plus bill rate. So this determines at which indirect rate are we going to bill our clients, and we have actual, provisional, or target as our options. And we have our revenue recognition rate here as well, which can also be actual, provisional, target. One thing to note, so looking at this example, we are billing at a provisional rate and we are recognizing revenue at an actual. So just keep in mind if we have two different rates selected here, the variance is going to run through our billing, our deferred revenue on our billing and revenue summary. Another thing to note would be here's the deferred revenue, and this is where the variance would go, and as well as our JSRs and our reports that allow us to pull the various rates. You can select target, provisional, or actual on the JSRs, but keep in mind your revenue is always going to be driven by the indirect rate that we have selected under those posting options. All right, so this is a pretty elementary slide here, but what is a cost-plus contract? It's essentially a contract where the contractor is paid for all of its allowable expenses up to a set limit, plus additional payments to allow the company to make a profit. The contract typically includes an estimate of total costs and establishes a ceiling that the contractor cannot exceed except at its own risk without the approval of the contracting officer. So here are the most commonly seen types of cost-plus contracts that we run across within our implementations, and we'll touch on each one of these individually as we go through this presentation. All right, so the first one that we see here is cost plus fixed fee. So this is the most common type of cost plus contract we run across, and this provides a payment of allowable costs plus a fixed fee. So this fee is typically billed in one of two ways. So sometimes we'll see it where it's billed as a percentage of costs as they are incurred with a cap applied to it. And on the other hand, we'll see it billed based upon some sort of predetermined fee schedule. In this case, there is typically a billing schedule for the fee that's established within the contract. So with that said, how do we handle cost plus fixed fee contracts? Well, the answer is, well, it really depends on how we're billing those costs. So the first scenario, if we bill it as a percentage of costs incurred, we're going to want to use our fee calculation methods that's available within Unanet. Whereas if we are billing based upon a predetermined schedule, we would want to set up a separate fixed price project and designate that as a contributor project to the cost plus effort. Let me just dive into the system here. I can show you some examples here. So for the first method, if we're billing our fee based upon a percentage of cost as it's incurred, within administrative setup, we do have fee calculation methods, and here's where you can customize, configure the formula that's going to be used to accumulate your costs, which would then be applied to the fee factor, which is set at the project level. So to give you an example here, so we have defined our fee calculation methods within admin setup, and here on the project profile of the accounting tab is where we would select which fee calculation method we wanted to use. We have factor types here where we can use a number or a percent. So in this case, we're applying 7% to total labor and ODC costs with a fee cap of $10,000. All right, the second scenario we had is if you bill the fee based upon a predetermined fee schedule. So in this instance, as we mentioned before, what we would want to do is we want to create a separate project for the fixed fee portion. So here's essentially, we have the primary cost plus project, and then we've added this contributor project. It's with a fixed price. So we'll dive into this profile. We've selected billing type of fixed price, and we have designated this particular project as a contributor to the primary cost plus project. This is via the project profile billing settings, and here's where we'll set up the fee schedule and how we're going to bill that. And then when we generate the invoice, you might want to create, if you're going this route, you might want to create a invoice format to account for that fee and designate it as fee here, so it shows up appropriately on the invoice. All right, so that is the cost plus fixed fee and how to handle that. The next type we have here is the cost plus incentive fee. This contract provides a fee that is adjusted by a formula according to the relationship of total allowable cost to target costs. Typically, there's a target cost, a target fee, a minimum and maximum fee, and then a fee adjustment formula are negotiated at the outset of the project. And then the fee is adjusted after contract performance using that formula to determine what the ultimate fee is. With this type of contract, we really have two options on how we can handle it. So the first option is we could record it as an additional item type on the invoice as at the point of invoice generation, right before we complete it. The second option is to use a fee calculation. Use the fee calculation method similar to what we did with the cost plus fixed fee recognized on a percent of cost incurred. We do the same thing, but then we record an offsetting additional item to essentially defer that fee, make it net to zero. And then once the contract's performance is ended and that fee is billable, we would add that fee to the invoice as an additional item. All right. So just real quick, additional items. I want to touch on this. So this is also within our administrative setup properties here. So this is where we can define our additional items. So for example, we have a fee deferral, we have a fee retention, and this is where we can create those items that can be added to the invoice. We also designate which accounts will be debited and credited when we add those items. All right, so here's an example for, so cost plus incentive fee. I kind of have both options written on this invoice currently. So I'll go to additional items here. I'll delete one of those, we'll save. So here's option number 2. So if we wanted to recognize the fee using the fee calculation method, we would set that up at the project level, and then at the time of invoice generation, we would go into our additional items. We would enter a negative balance to essentially offset the fee that was generated via fee calculation and essentially defer it. The benefit to using this method here is that the revenue is recognized on an ongoing basis as it's been earned, whereas if we simply added the fee as an additional item, then our revenue for that fee is going to be recognized at the point of invoice completion. So essentially it's when billed. So if we were to go that route, instead of using the fee deferral, you would just essentially add it to the invoice, the additional item. and then here we'll have the fee on the invoice. All right. So let's see, the third one that's pretty common has to do with its cost plus award fee. So this contract is typically used by the government when they want to motivate a contractor, and it's typically linked to identifiable outcomes, discrete events or milestones, and structured in a way to try to get the contractor to focus on meeting or exceeding costs. How to handle this one, this would typically be either a fixed item or an additional item at the point of invoice generation, or essentially we could create a fixed price project, similar to what we did with the cost plus fixed fee, where we're billing it as a percentage of costs as they're incurred. We would handle that in a similar manner, and then we designate it as a contributor project. All right, let's see, the fourth cost plus contract that we typically run into is cost plus with, say, a rate cap. On these contracts, typically some sort of indirect rate ceiling is established. G&A seems to be the most common one. We have an example here of where we can bill fringe overhead and G&A, but we have a cap on G&A that limits it to, say, 15%. So in this scenario, what we would want to do is we want to create a separate cost structure where we can input those cap rates, and then we'd reference that new cost structure within both the project profile and the people assignments. Let me jump back into Unanet and I'll show you what I mean. So here's our cost structures. And within these cost structures where we can manage what our indirect rates are going to be. So within this one, we've capped the G&A rate at 15%. So keep in mind your posting option. So we're billing the client within this demo, we're billing them at the provisional rate, but we're recognizing revenue at the actual rate. So in this example, we would want to cap both of those at 15%. So therefore we aren't recognizing revenue for more than we're going to be reimbursed for. So once you've configured, you set up your separate cost structure, there's essentially two places you'll have to designate within that project that you're using that particular cost structure. So on the project profile of the accounting tab, we have the option to designate our cost structure here. So whichever cost structure we select here on the accounting tab, this is what's going to be applied to our expenses that are charged to the project. When it comes to labor and how the labor costs or which cost structure labor costs are going to apply to, that's going to be managed within our people assignments here. So when you assign individuals to a particular project, you have the option to select the cost element, and within that cost element, you can also designate the cost structure that should be used. So essentially, you would you create that capped rate, cost rate structure, and then you designate the project to that cost rate structure, and you'd also assign all your people to that individual cost structure as well. All right. So let's see some other considerations to think about when it comes to cost plus. So the fee calculation method, that is an option that's only available at the project level. So I guess the lesson there is if we have any specifically funded efforts with an associated fee cap. What we want to do is segregate those as a separate project within Unanet. It's something we can't manage at the task level because we don't have that fee calculation method at the task level. All right, funded value limits. So within Unanet, and when you input funded values at either the project or the task level, we do have an option to limit billing or revenue to the funded value. The caveat to this is with a couple of our suggestions, for example, the cost plus award fee, we mentioned that you can capture that via an additional item. Same goes for cost plus incentive fee. We could use additional items to capture that. Just remember that additional items are not considered in the billing and revenue caps. All right, see, fee retainage. So with this, what we mean by fee retainage is, let's say you can bill a fee that's, say, 10% of total cost, but within the contract, it specifies that you need to retain, you need to hold back, say, 15% of that fee until contract performance has been completed. In that case, the way we would handle that is we'd set up the fee calculation method within the project, and then we use an additional item. And let me jump into my additional items here. We have we'd set up a fee retention, and essentially at the invoice we would calculate what the retained amount should be, where we would debit billed and credit unbilled, but essentially we enter it as a negative item on the invoice. And once contract performance is ended, we would reverse it and enter it as a positive item. All right, this is a little off topic here since we're talking cost plus, but we do run into quite a few scenarios where our clients have T&M contracts, but they essentially will mark up any expenses that are charged to that project by a G&A rate. One way to handle this scenario is for your T&M contracts, you could set up a project, a T&M project, and then you'd set up a contributor project as a cost plus, and you would route the expenses to that project. And then within that cost structure, you would only designate that G&A rates are applied to that. All right. Before we get to that slide, I did want to mention one other thing. So several of the topics, so we talked about adding the fee as an additional item, adding it as potentially a fixed price item via fixed price schedule. And we also talked about using the actual fees method to capture the fee associated with cost plus contracts. I just wanted to point out, so within our cost reports, and this is within admin setup, this is where we can define how the report is calculating certain items. So in scenarios where we're capturing fee as fixed price item, what we can do there is we have a report element called revenue fixed price that we could reference, and we could tag it as fee revenue. Therefore, it could be its own separate line item on your JSRs and your project accounting reports. Same thing goes for your additional items. We could segregate those as well as the actual fees calculation method. All right. This slide is some additional resources that discusses and covers topics we discussed today. Which you could reference. These are links here that you could reference in the future. I know I kind of went through that pretty quick. This is time for questions.
So, hi Jason, it's Patty. We do have a couple questions. So our first question is when you set up the fee cap, how do you prevent the system to not bill the whole fee at once? Right now, when we place in the fee cap, it tries to bill the entire amount.
When you set the fee cap, it bills the entire amount.
Yeah, so I'll read it one more time. Did you get the question?
Yeah, can you repeat it again?
Sure. When you set up the fee cap, how do you prevent the system to not bill the whole fee at once? Right now, when we put in the fee cap, it tries to bill the entire amount.
Oh, for here? Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think it should behave. So if we put in the fee cap and then we put in the factor here, it should bill, you know, as a percent of cost incurred. I don't know, Christiane, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Jason, that's a good question. The only thought that I initially had was that if the total fee calculation method is coming out with the amount that's equal to or exceeding your fee amount, that's why it would try to bill that all at once. But otherwise, I don't see why that fee amount would be trying to bill all at once. I guess we might need to follow up with the person that's asked the question just to confirm that we're thinking about all the same things here. So.
Okay, all right, we have another question, and you know, if anybody else has any questions out there, feel free to put them in the chat box. Our next question is when we set up a cost plus contributor project, it doesn't total the funding balance across all projects, the lead plus contributor. Is there a way to make this work?
So, yeah, one way you could do, right, is you could break out the funded value. So if we're setting up a contributor project to capture that fee, we could essentially take that fee funded value and move it to the contributor project. You know, another option, I know within, say, we'll look at the project revenue and funding summary. You do have the capability to group, well, you can run it on multiple projects, and then it could give you totals for those projects. So here it would sum up your funded values for you, and you could see a total variance amongst the lead and contributor projects. So that's one option, and another one I could think of would be splitting up those funded values amongst the projects. What about you, Christiane? You got any other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I kind of thought about the same idea in the reports. For example, if you're running your job cost summary report and you use the function to roll up the multiple projects together, that will sum the values up at the header area. Yeah, so that'll then show the total sum of the funding value and the total value. So even if you hadn't split it across the projects, one project is 0 and the other has the total value, you would see that with the total values of both projects contributing to that roll-up block.
Okay, we have one more question. And it is, what steps do you take when your cost plus fixed fee revenue stops calculating correctly?
So yeah, I'd say the first step I would take is to look at the posting options. So here, you know, if we're billing the client based upon provisional rates, and then we're recognizing a fee based upon actuals, whenever we run our JSRs or any of those reports with the cost report definition, the revenue amount and the fee amount is going to be based upon the actuals. So it could be a variance between what you're billing and what you're seeing as revenue on your JSRs due to the different recognition and bill and billing methods that's selected here. I guess if that doesn't work, I would you know, do a thorough review of your fee calculation methods that are set up here to make sure that the formula is accurately defined within this setup.
Okay, so that's all the questions we have. Unless we'll give it a couple more minutes and a couple minutes here and see if anybody else has any more they want to type in. Christiane, would you like to continue the presentation?
I sure can. Well, we'll see if any more questions come in while I'm switching over. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. If you do have any further questions, please let us know.
So just as a reminder, you can see we have a Unanet University. What you're seeing on your screen now is our upcoming classes. So be sure to check them out. You can also go on to unanet.com and you can find the schedule of the university classes there as well. If you have any questions, don't forget we have our support team. You can reach them at support@unanet.com or their phone number is up there. They're available 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And also, remember you have your customer success management team, and you can also reach us at csm@unanet.com if you have any questions also. You can also check out our recorded webinars on the Knowledge Center. And thank you so much for joining us.